Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and discusses 5 outstanding books in some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. The Council of Trent ran from 1545 to 1563. It is the 19th of the 21 ecumenical councils and one of the most influential ones. It was convoked by Paul III, who oversaw the first 8 sessions, and continued during sessions 12 and 16 under Julius III, and during sessions 17 to 25 under Pius IV. The Council of Trent addressed Protestant doctrines and prescribed a series of important ecclesial reforms. In its doctrinal decrees, it specified the canon of Scripture and clarified the nature of original sin, justification, and the sacraments. In this interview, Nelson H. Minnich discusses the Council of Trent. Nelson H. Minnich is Ordinary Professor of Church History at the Catholic University of America, where he has taught Renaissance, Reformation, and Counter-Reformation history since 1977. Since 2005, he has been editor of the Catholic Historical Review. He is author of various books, including The Cambridge Companion to the Council of Trent. The books discussed in this episode are, first, History of the Council of Trent by Hubert Jeden. Second, Trent, What Happened at the Council by John W. O'Malley from the Society of Jesus. Third, The Cambridge Companion to the Council of Trent, edited by Nelson H. Minnich. And fourth, Decrees of the Ecumenical Councils, Volume 2, edited by Norman Tanner, Society of Jesus. Links to these books are available in the show notes of this episode and on the corresponding article on the webpage. And if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Professor Nelson Minnich, welcome.
Thank you.
The Council of Trent began less than 30 years after the close of the Fifth Lateran Council, which decreed various measures of ecclesial reform. Why was another council needed so soon after Lateran V?
There are a number of reasons. The issues raised at Trent were different than those raised at Lateran V. If you're interested in the question of reform, the implementation of those decrees was delayed. For example, the council ended in 1517. It wasn't until 1520 that the decrees of the council were printed, and they were sent out to the metropolitans to distribute throughout Christendom. Enforcement of the decrees was left to the local ordinaries. By 1520, new issues had arisen. Martin Luther, in 1517, had posted his 95 Theses, and the topics changed. Now it was justification by faith alone. This became the hot topic. So a new council was ultimately needed to resolve these questions because it wasn't clear just what was Catholic teaching on these points.
Were the Catholic princes of Europe keen to have the council, indifferent to the prospect, or downright hostile to it?
A lot of politics came into the calling of the Council of Trent. In Germany, a number of princes sided with Luther against Rome, and the emperor at the time, a young man, Charles V, sided with the papacy. Charles V was feared by many, many people. He seemed to have too much power and threatened the power of other peoples. For example, in Germany, the princes, the elector princes, did not want a centralization of authority, such as was going on in Spain and France and England. They wanted to keep the power to themselves. And as long as the emperor had difficulty imposing Catholicism, this was to their advantage. Also, the neighbors of Charles V feared him, especially the King of France. He felt surrounded by Charles Habsburg. To his west was Spain, and the Emperor Charles V was also King of Spain. To his east was up in what we call the Netherlands, and Charles V was the Duke of Burgundy, and he controlled that land. Charles V also controlled the Kingdom of Naples, which the King of France claimed. He also was overlord of Milan, which the King of France claimed. So the King of France felt surrounded by Charles V and was eager to diminish his power. And a council that would resolve the conflicts in Germany were not to his advantage. He wanted Charles V way down with all the problems in Germany. So we find a strange situation where various rulers are hostile to the Council of Trent, such as the King of France is hostile to it. In England, when Henry VIII goes off into schism, he does not want the Council of Trent resolving issues. The Scandinavians had gone Lutheran. They did not want the Council of Trent. So when you look at who was in favor of the Council of Trent, it was Charles V, who represented Spain, and Portugal was allied with him. So also the papacy, interestingly enough, was not keen on calling a council. Why would that be? For one thing, if a council succeeded, it would increase the power of Charles V, and the various popes were afraid to death that Charles V would dominate Italy and the popes would become his chaplain. So they opposed the Council of Trent. In addition, they had a bad experience at the previous council, which was the Council of Lateran V. At that council, which was held in Rome, you would have thought the Pope controlled everything and everything would go smoothly. That was not the case. Even in Rome, the bishops were rebellious. They were demanding that papal power be cut back and that their jurisdictional authority be restored. And it was very, very difficult for Leo X to control this. He was only able to close the council by a vote of 3 extra votes. So he felt the Pope saw councils as very dangerous because councils seemed to always want to cut back papal power. So they were not eager to call a council. I hope does that explain things?
Yes, perfectly. Why was the council held not at Rome, but in the Tyrolese town of Trent, then part of the Holy Roman Empire?
The location of the council was a very difficult issue and much debated. Rome wanted a council that it could control, and it preferred a council to be held in Italy. The Germans said, no. Council held in Italy will be under the control of the Pope, and Luther and the Protestants will not get a fair hearing. Luther himself and the German diets called for what they called a free Christian council in German lands. The theory being that where the problem arose, there the solution should be found. So a council should be held in what's called German lands. Now the question is, where in German lands? The emperor, or the popes try to play kind of a game with this. They tried to hold the council in Italy that was in imperial lands. So Paul III initially in 1538 tried to call the council to meet in Mantua, which was an imperial fiefdom. So you could claim this is German, it's Italian, but it's within the Holy Roman Empire. But that fell apart. The local Marquis of Mantua could not provide security. So the popes tried to move the council. We'll say, okay, well, we'll put it in neutral territory. We'll put it in Venetian territory in Vicenza. So they called the council for there. Only 5 bishops showed up. That was a disaster. That wouldn't work. So they had to find some place in German lands. The French, if they were going to come to the council, they wanted a location that was easily accessible. So there's a lot of suggestions to put the council in some city along the Rhine River, which would be much more accessible to French or to anyone else who wanted to come to the council. The popes were not in favor of this. They had a bad experience at Basel, which was on the Rhine River. So they tried to find some kind of solution. And the solution they came up with was the city of Trent. Trent was an unusual location. It was in Italy. However, it was only 80 miles south of the imperial residence in Innsbruck across the Bremner Pass. It was a bilingual city. Most of the people living there spoke Italian, but German was also spoken by a good portion of the city. And 5 miles to the north of Trent, everyone spoke German. So, and also it was within the Holy Roman Empire. It was the ruler of it was a prince bishop. He was civil ruler and spiritual ruler at the same time. He was a member of the German Diet. He was part of the Holy Roman Empire. So Trent seemed to be the location that would satisfy everyone. It was in Italy. The Pope he hoped he could get a lot of Italians to attend it. It was within German lands. So it was a compromise that they came up with.
Did the council start out with a clear agenda, or did it work it out along the way?
Traditionally, councils deal with 3 elements. They try to define the faith, they try to remove abuses, and they try to encourage peace among Christian princes or defense of Christendom with the crusade. So those 3 object goals were in the decree of the convocation. But once the council met, the cardinal legates decided that this topic of peace was not to be addressed by the council. They would waste a lot of time on this. Let the Pope handle that, getting peace among Christian princes and the crusade. So the council agenda came down to 2 items, faith and reform. Now, the papacy was very keen to define just what is Catholic faith so that we know where the Protestants have gone wrong. The emperor, however, was not keen on defining Catholic faith because he felt that would close the door to any reconciliation with the Protestants. So he was in favor of reform, thinking that once we reformed the church, the Protestant anger at the church would diminish because the church had been reformed. So the question was, how do we resolve this tension between the papal agenda and the imperial agenda, doctrine or reform? The compromise was that they would handle both simultaneously, that when they defined a doctrine, they would try to reform at the same time any abuses related to it. So if you look at the decrees of the Council of Trent, you will find in each session a doctrinal reform and then a doctrinal statement and then a reform decree.
During the council, were there any crises that threatened to derail it?
Were there any crises? It was a series of crises. It seemed to never stop. It was the perils of Pauline, one after another. The famous Arthur Dickens claimed that it's a miracle that the council ever succeeded. It seemed like every time you turned around, it was on the verge of collapsing. And yet, how do you explain this? It must be the Holy Spirit that made the council succeed, because it was always a crisis going on. For example, as soon as the council met, the question was, how are we going to discuss these issues? The bishops wanted to discuss it themselves. However, they brought to the council advisors they called periti. The Pope himself sent experts to the council, and the bishops wanted to exclude these periti from any discussions. The cardinals, the legates, and the 2 cardinals who were there who weren't legates said, hey, this doesn't work. The word they used was indecens. This is unbecoming. We have here all these experts on theology and canon law. And let's face it, you bishops, most of you are not experts in theology or in canon law. How are you going to discuss and come up with good resolutions of these issues without the help of these theologians and canonists? So the legates decided, no, the theologians and the canonists are going to participate in these discussions. So they started off with dividing up the bishops. At the beginning of the council, there was only like 35 bishops present. So they divide them up into three groups with a cardinal in charge of each group. And they would meet like 10 to 12 people and started discussing these issues. What the cardinal legates wrote back to Rome was, this has proven out to be a disaster. The bishops hate this procedure. You can imagine what was going on here when a theological discussion came up and the bishops gave their opinion, and they were not experts in theology. And then the theologian chimed in and pointed out how wrong their views were. Bishops did not like this at all, and it was becoming a disaster. And the cardinal legates had to come up with a solution. So they came up with this solution. I guess you would call it a teach-in. So they separated the bishops from the experts, the theologians and the canonists, and they had what were called particular congregations. So when an issue came up, they would take the issue before the theologians and the canonists and have them discuss it among themselves. So you had all these periti debating these issues. Who was in the audience? The bishops. So it was a teach-in. This is the way of bringing the bishops up to speed on these theological issues. And when the bishops felt that now we understand what's involved here. Thank you, theologians. Thank you, canonists. Bye-bye. Now we're prepared to discuss it themselves. So that was the first crisis, you might say, resolving how to proceed on this. Then we have a whole series of other problems. The bishops, some of them, wanted to have the council decreed in this decree stated that it represents the universal church. What does this mean? This is a formula that was used in the councils of the previous century, which declared that the council is supreme, that it has its authority directly from God, and everyone has to obey it, even the Pope. So you can imagine the papal legates were not happy with this formula. They did not want that formula in the decrees. They wanted the decrees with the apostolic legates presiding, meaning that the agenda of the council is in the hands of the papal representatives, and ultimately the authority of the council comes from the Pope, not directly from God. So that was another crisis that they confronted. Another crisis they confronted was on the question of justification. There were attempts to find some kind of reconciliation with the Protestants, and some of the theologians came up with the idea of double justification, trying to put together the traditional Catholic view with the Lutheran view of imputed justice. So you would have inherent justice, meaning sanctifying grace, and then you would have, in addition, imputed justice being covered over with the merits of Christ. Well, when this was brought up to discussion, a number of theologians denounced it as this doesn't make any sense. When you are justified and you receive sanctifying grace, you receive a sharing in the divine life. You don't need then to be covered over with the merits of Christ. You already have God's life within you with sanctifying grace. So there was a battle going on here between the Augustinian group, who favored double justification, and the more Thomistic group who said, we don't need this is just confusing. So that was resolved, of course, in the favor of the Thomistic position. So that was a second crisis, you might say, that occurred. Another crisis came when the Italians did not like being in Trent. It was cold in the winter. The winds and snow came down off the Alps. It was an unpleasant place to be in. It was in a valley, the Adige Valley, and during the summer it was hot and sweaty, and it wasn't a pleasant place to be. And also there was always the fear that the Lutheran armies may come through the Bremner Pass over the Alps and attack the council. So the Italians were always eager to get the council out of Trent, and the papal legates were on their side. So they were trying to find an occasion to move the council out of Trent. And the occasion came when there was an outbreak of typhus, or there was suspicion of an outbreak of typhus. And the cardinal legates used this as a reason for moving the council, and they wanted to move it to the papal states, to Bologna. Well, you can imagine the imperial representatives said, wait a minute, this council has to be in German lands. Bologna is surely not in German lands. So what happened is when they moved the council to Bologna, there was a schism. The imperial bishops, that would include the Spanish and any from the Holy Roman Empire, stayed in Trent, while the Italians moved down to Bologna. So we had, in a sense, two councils going on, one in Trent and one in Bologna. So that was a big crisis. And how you're going to solve this? And the Pope was afraid to death that we already have a schism between Catholics and Lutherans. Now we're going to have a schism within the Catholic fold between the imperials and the Italians. So the Pope told the people in Bologna, you can discuss all this theological stuff, but do not issue any decree that is doctrinal or reforming the church. You can just say, we are here in Bologna, legitimately gathered, and we're continuing the council. So that was another crisis. It was ultimately resolved by the Pope closing down the council in Bologna, and that ended that one.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.